Hello, welcome to One Nation Underdog. I'm Mark Harvey. In this video, we're going to be discussing the Marxist approach to trade, advanced by dependency and world systems theorists, and we're going to discuss whether or not this is a legitimate means to understand and explain trade patterns that occur in the international system. Using the model of comparative advantage and specialization, neoliberals argue that poor states can get rich through free trade. Marxists say, wait a minute, maybe it doesn't happen quite that simply or that easily. And so the models that we're going to share today question whether or not this model of comparative advantage actually works.
If you want to look at it in terms of international trade, there's a guy named Immanuel Wallerstein. He basically argues that there are two types of states in the world, and technically he says three, but we're going to simplify things and call it two. There are core states and there are peripheral states. Now, what kind of countries do you think would be the core of the international system? Okay, the United States would be a core, right? But yeah, probably Japan, Britain, yeah, exactly. We're talking about countries that are rich, that are capitalist, that are mostly democratic, right? That comprises the core of the system. And the peripheral countries, at least in this illustration anyway, we could argue is the everybody else, the poorer countries, right? These countries have a tendency to be characterized by dictatorship, by lack of goods. Within each core, there's a core and a periphery. And within each periphery, there's also a core and a periphery. So within the core state, who would you say the core is there? Okay, so the upper class, and who does that involve? Who is in the upper class usually in a rich Western state?
Business owners.
Okay, rich business owners maybe, at least the elite business owners, the top ones, what'd you say?
Political figures.
Right, and political figures, right? So the people who are on the top of the economic, the political hierarchy, okay? And the periphery would be sort of the everybody else. You know, your middle, lower class, you know, even rich folks who aren't quite as connected, right? So the core is the government and multinational corporations. That's the core of the core, right? The core of the periphery. You've got the everybody else. We're voters, we're consumers. We're made up of professional and blue-collar workers, right? We vote and we spend. That's how we make most of our important decisions. In the peripheral state, you also have a core and periphery. Who would the core in that country be?
The dictator.
Okay, dictator probably. And a few others too.
Sure.
The military? Okay, absolutely. The military is sort of part of that core elite. And there's at least one other, I would say, and that's the landed elite. Those are the people who own the land. Many of these countries tend to be at least primarily agricultural countries. Owning land is a very important thing from that standpoint, and even to the extent that there's a diversification into manufacturing, owning property becomes extremely important there, right? And that's generally situated in the hands of just a few people. And then in the periphery of the peripheral state, you have poor, landless, agricultural, and urban laborers. People who are really at that bottom rung of society and really in the world for that matter too. So then, any sort of trade is a relationship. And so the question is, how do these different parties relate to each other? And the first question is, how does the core of the core and the periphery of the core relate to each other? I'll throw a few things up here. I'll just say, first of all, if you're a government, if you're part of the government or multinational, you're interested in maintaining the system the way it is, right? Which means that in a democratic system, these people are going to have to keep voting for you to stay in power, or in a commercial system, they're going to have to keep wanting to buy your products or else you go out of business, right? And so core leaders want to satisfy the peripheral electorate, the you and me, and they do it with cheap import prices and a strong economy. Strong economy means jobs. Cheap import prices means you can afford consumer products at an affordable level, so you can live in affluence. And as long as that arrangement maintains itself, then you, the periphery, have no reason to revolt. You got no reason to question the situation. Everything's cool. It's just when that starts unraveling, like in a major financial crisis or something like that, where then people start getting a little nervous, and then the government has to step and fetch, and businesses have to adjust and stuff, right? But we want stability, right? We want those good growth rates, and we want those cheap products. As long as things are cool, as long as prices are low and oil prices aren't out of control and everything else, we don't have any reason to question authority. We don't have any reason to mess with the government or anything like that, right? And so what you have to understand is that even though this isn't like a conspiracy, it's not a smoke-filled room where the multinational corporations sit in the same room as the politicians and think about, hey, how can we all kind of keep this good arrangement going? You've got to understand that both of them have a mutual interest in mind. And that is that multinational corporations want to continue to deliver cheap products to Americans so that they can continue to buy, right? So it continues to stimulate them, right? Politicians want to continue to maintain a strong economy, and that means that stuff has to continue to be affordable for you guys. And so then the question is, how do we arrange to keep those prices low?
We go to the peripheral state.
Oh, that's right. They're the places with cheap labor, right? So it makes sense to the government to allow that level of outsourcing, and it makes sense to the multinational corporation to allow that level of outsourcing. And so nobody's going to stand in anybody's way if it means that you guys are able to get cheap products. So let's go to the next step, right? So the next thing is, what does the core of the core have to offer the core of the periphery? That is, how do these two relate to each other? And what does the core of the periphery have to offer the core of the core? Well, the core of the core, right, government and multinational corporations, offers investment, they offer kickbacks to these military dictators and such, and they offer security. In exchange, the dictator basically says, hey, your multinational corporations can come in here and set up shop, and we'll give you cheap labor. That's awesome. We'll give you what you want. But there's a slight problem, though, in that, what happens if these workers don't necessarily like where they're at? They end up being paid pennies per hour or whatever.
They don't have a choice where they live, so.
We may not have a choice, right? Okay, so maybe they're interchangeable and you just hire more of them. I think that's true. Well, what can happen if these people start getting upset or they start starving or start, Okay, so you might have some violence. You might have violence against the plant. You might have what we might call security problems. Who's going to take care of the security problems?
The government.
The military? Okay, so you can call in whatever the country's military is, and how's that going to be supported? With the money and the guns that the United States gave them, and the training. So you protest and we'll shoot at you with American guns and money. I mean, that was the pattern throughout South and Central America long before the 1980s, although the 1980s is one time period where it got particularly bad. The United States would go in there and train death squads to go and kill people who would protest on behalf of workers. I mean, we're talking about like nuns, totally innocent, like non-violent sort of people. But yeah, we kind of put the hit on certain people who thought that they were troublemakers. We tell their governments to send the death squads in after them, and people got killed. Right? Why? Because we have commercial interests there. Read about the history of the United Fruit Company. Read about the history of the oil companies in the world. It's a history of exploitation. The same is true under when multinational corporations go into these countries and exploit cheap labor. We basically pay for the security. And so the United States supports dictators throughout the world, which is one reason, to bring it back to current events, why it was such a problem when Mubarak was on his way out, why the U.S. government couldn't just sort of say, well, get him out of there, he's not democratic. Why? Because we had a good arrangement with the guy, right? In a way, he was there to advance our commercial interests. He was also there to advance our security interests. He was somebody who'd be like, okay, I'll try to keep the Al-Qaeda guys at bay, and, that Muslim Brotherhood too, boy, they're scary, let's, give me some more money, we'll deal with them too, right? So even though he was an autocrat, we were willing to pay for him if it meant that we advance our commercial and our security interests. And that story has been true throughout U.S. history, quite honestly, not just in the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years. That is to say that if I'm placing my business in a peripheral country, and I'm the head of a multinational corporation, I want to make sure that place is safe. And if it's not safe, that is, there are people who are upset because they've lost their land over so many years, or they're poor, they're desperate, they need food, or who knows what. You've got some tribe that's making a territorial claim and they're attacking your facilities, right? You've got to be safe, you've got to be protected. And how do they get protection? Core. The core. Get it from the core. They don't have a whole lot of money themselves, right? So the core basically funds the peripheral, the core of the periphery, to use death squads, or to train their military, or to do whatever it takes in order to make sure that that business is protected. If that means shooting at protesters, That means killing people who are on the streets, who are protesting, doing food riots or whatever, in order to maintain whatever stability it takes to keep your business safe. That's what they're paying for. And the government, your tax money, is paying for that in part. Why? Because those multinational corporations need to continue to thrive. Because if they don't thrive, our growth rate goes down, you guys end up losing jobs, and we can't continue to provide the cheap Nikes that we want in order to keep those cheap consumer goods down. The core of the periphery, on the other hand, what do they offer? Right? Access to cheap labor and cheap resources. Same as always for infinity on into history. It's what they want. And then how do the core of the periphery and the periphery of the periphery, these two relate to each other? Well, core leaders, that is the dictator, offers low wages jobs for people who cooperate, and the periphery faces violence if they revolt, if they complain, if they demand higher wages. So in other words, your cheap consumer products are on the sweat of people who are not just working for slave wages, but also working under extremely coercive conditions. The final question is, how do these two peripheries relate to each other? The answer is they don't. Right? I mean, what interest do you have in common with somebody who's working in a sweatshop halfway across the world? You might be sad for them, right? But they give you your cheap Nikes. They get you your cheap lamps at Walmart. Right? That supports your lifestyle. And they don't have resources to mobilize help. And we may not appreciate the exploitation, but we're willing to look the other way while it's going on. That's them, and we don't care. We'll take our cheap Nikes. We're all right with that. There's a few college kids that cry about it for a while, but most of us will keep shopping at Walmart. It's fine. And that's reality. That's the way it is. So that's basically a Marxist explanation of how trade works in the world. Is that an accurate description? This is not totally crazy nut stuff that I'm talking about here. Are these trade relationships going to change given the structure?
I don't.
Not likely. So that's what Marx is basically arguing. It's like, it's Wallerstein's argument, but he basically made it on a domestic level. It's like, just the way it is. The poor are going to continue to get exploited because the wealthy just have more money and more power and more guns. And the only way that's going to change is if, a few poor folks, like out in Libya or something like that, pick up some guns and start shooting at people. It's such a happy, inspiring lecture.
If there's any one thing you can take from this model, it's to keep in mind that even though we would like to believe that economics and business are driven by the simplicity of economic actions and what is most efficient and makes the most money and saves the most money, a lot of times this gets really mucked up by the process of politics. And as long as politics are involved in economics, power becomes an important consideration as well. And so one question I'd like you to consider as you remember or think about this video is this a legitimate means of explaining how trade occurs? Are these scholars right? For One Nation Underdog, I'm Mark Harvey.